For a long time man has searched for a way to achieve immortality. Or at least, get the longevity that the prophets enjoyed in ancient times. They dedicated themselves to searching hard for the philosopher's stone, which was a divine substance, capable of transmuting lead into gold and granting eternal youth. Those men who tried to find the formula of such a substance in the Middle Ages were the forerunners of the chemical science of our time. Although it must also be said, they were fiercely persecuted by the Inquisition, to immediately accuse them of witchcraft, and later burn them at the stake. It seems that nobody succeeded, with the exception of the Count of Saint-Germain, back in the 1750s. He tells us about the violet flame, which is an energy capable of projecting matter from its natural state to a higher one, increasing its frequency. Therefore, it is not surprising that he always looked young despite the years go by. On the other hand, if we speak of Jesus Christ, we have to say that he did die on the cross, although he probably rose again in 3 days, as the sacred scripture tells us. It is paradoxical. How is it that a being who has control over life and death died? He never used that power to save himself, but he did save Lazarus. All this happened, perhaps, because that was not the will of the Father. At least that's what he gave us to understand. When being on the cross and about to die, he left his fate to the will of God. But the most fascinating story, and that refers to the man who never died, is told by a book called Rantha's White Book, channeled by an American woman named Hoda Zadokune. This book, that today is unknown by many people, was a bestseller in the United States in the mid-80s of the last century. The story is set in the lost continents of Lemuria and Atlantis, many millennia ago from our time. And the following happened. That a child was born in Lemuria and then came to Atlantis, the lemurs being despised, enslaved, spit upon and even urinated by the proud Atlanteans who handled high technology. The mother of that child died of hunger and absolute poverty, and his brother, who was from another father, had been taken away by a lustful Atlantean. That is how he was left alone, and at first he did not blame the unknown god in whom they believed. But it happened that one day, he saw a great mountain in the distance, and he thought that if his god was somewhere it would be there. So he walked for 90 days eating roots and ants until he reached the top, but he did not find the god, but only a terrible cold that froze the tears that he shed from the disappointment of having traveled for nothing. He was at that when suddenly a beautiful woman appeared to him who gave him a great giant sword, which a single man could not carry. However, for the boy it did not weigh much. He was asked to use it well. He no longer felt cold, and when he turned to see where his last tear had fallen, he could see a beautiful flower growing. He understood then, that it was about hope. Disappointed in life for not having a family, he began to fight against the Atlanteans without any fear and wishing they would kill him because he did not want to live. But it turns out that when fear does not exist, triumph accompanies you. And so it happened. One fine day, still being a boy and having something like 500 people who followed him, he wanted to give up continuing to direct them, but when they sang a song to him they convinced him to continue fighting, not because of his hope, because he had already lost yours, but to fight for everyone else's hope. They crossed forests and deserts, rivers and mountains without a fixed course, from one side to the other. Little by little, his army grew bigger and bigger because of the people who joined them. In such a way that it brought together more than 2 million people who wandered from one place to another and who sowed justice wherever they passed. They terrorized the villains and defended the weak, but it happened that one day, when passing through a territory, a messenger invited him to see his king. He came. It was a luxurious palace that had exquisite rooms, beautiful women, splendid gardens, great wealth, and mute servants whose tongues had been cut out. The next day they asked him to hand over his sword and invited him to come into a room where there were some tall black slaves, all decorated with gold and precious stones right down to their feet. After a small dialogue with his king with an athletic body, although not very tall, one of the blacks buried a large sword in his back, so that it completely pierced his body. He felt his life escape him when he saw the flow of his blood. He thought of many at the time and believed that his end had come. However, a voice within him said, "Get up," and got up. At that moment they all fled the palace, as they verified what was said about him. That he was immortal. Everything seemed so. Immediately after that, he raised that kingdom, returning to the sword that buried him. It took him several months to recover. And while that was happening, he dreamed and wanted fervently to be like the wind. That idea haunted him every day and at all hours. Such was his degree of obsession that the moment came when he succeeded. It became the wind. It was a power he wielded at will and when he wanted it. This is how he began spying on his enemies, to find out how they were going to attack him. As you may have guessed, of course he anticipated his enemies. With this great power, he managed to dominate 2/3 of the planet. However, and even if we do not want it, for terrestrial beings everything has its end, at 63 years of age near the Indus River, of course, that of India, being with a group of warriors and some women, this man began to rise from the ground. While the warriors threw their swords, the women watched in terror as Ramtha said goodbye to all of them, never to return. His people called him Ram, which in English means ram. He came to have a palace on the plain that housed 130 of his children, well cared for and protected. Sometimes he was there, and sometimes he lived in the mountains, on an embankment, surrounded by soldiers where life was more boring. That is then his story. According to the document referred to, this being never physically died, simply changed from one plane of existence to another. Read the document, it is interesting, and subscribe to my channel and give it a like if you liked the information.